Hey,
Hello.
hello. Just let everyone join a second.
I'm Vahid, by the way. I think we never met.
Oh, it's nice to meet you. I am Mike. We'll do like introductions to like the broad audience, I guess, when we kick it off. So if you don't mind doing that, I'll kind of, I guess, call on you when we get started.
Yeah, I'm mobile engineer in Spotify. So
Perfect. Well, welcome. Nice
thanks.
to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All right. Hello. Morning. For those that are in the US at least. All right. Looks like we got a pretty good turnout. Does anyone maybe want to take a crack at being a scribe before we kick off? See that we don't have anyone that's set up for that yet.
Actually based in Berlin, but like to know where other people are based mostly.
I think we have a pretty broad distribution of people. I'm in the Detroit area, but if others want to chime in, yeah, New York, Canada, yeah, Berlin, almost Canada. So yeah, pretty good distribution. And we got Poland. Nice. Cool. I'll try to act as scribe. If I get distracted, that is why. And I'm posting the meeting notes here in the list. So if you don't mind adding yourself as a participant, if you have any agenda items or questions, feel free to add it. And it looks like we can go ahead and get started. So
I can, if you would prefer me to be scribe, I'm happy to be. If you've got stuff you need to talk about.
We can try to do it jointly if you want. I just have one topic on here, but I can do my best. So yeah, if you don't mind, that would be.
I'll step in for your topic. How about that?
Thank you.
I'll do the same.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah, so we could do new attendees. If you're interested in unmuting yourself and saying hi, please do that.
Hi.
Hey, and maybe a slight introduction, I guess, too. I should elaborate.
Well, do as much as you're comfortable with.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nikki. This is my second time joining an OpenFeature meetup. I am working at Spotify, and we, as some of you might know, have been working on the Kotlin and on Swift SDK. So I'm part of that.
Perfect. Welcome. All right.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I don't know if like everyone was here when I said I introduced myself, but I'm Vahid. I'm also a mobile engineer in Spotify working on this case. It's my
cool.
first.
Nice to meet you.
Great. I guess I can close the Spotify loop then. Fabrizio here. I was in the same meetup last time as well. Also working on Spotify. Nice to meet you all.
Awesome. Nice to meet you. All right. I think we can probably get started. Just as a reminder, if you have any other topics, questions, whatever, feel free to either add them to the list here or just ask during the meeting. But first up, it looks like Todd wants to give an update on the client side.
Yeah, and any of the folks from Spotify can feel free to hop in. I wasn't sure if any of you guys would be here, but I'm gonna start with stuff on that. So yeah, from my end, I've basically gone completely through the Kotlin SDK, and it looks really good. I'd say like it's in a state where it might honestly be in a state now where it could be added to the OpenFeature organization and housed by the OpenFeature. Yeah, just maintained as a repository within the org. I'm a little bit on the fence as to whether or not it's in a place where we can do an initial release. And I think without going into too much detail, I'll actually add the review. I'll wait till I'm done talking, but I'll add the review in the notes, in the meeting notes. But without going into too much detail, I think my only real concern at this point is there's a little bit of a behavior mismatch in set provider, the function that sets a provider on the SDK globally, and really it comes down to whether or not we kind of want to block and initialize that provider before that function returns or not, or find some way of navigating that. Most of the current SDK implementations, what they do is they just set the provider immediately. There's no initialization that takes place on that provider while that call blocks. And the way that you're kind of supposed to know that the provider is ready to be used is to listen for the onReady event. So that's like the basics of it, especially if the provider needs to do some network requests or IO of some kind. The initialization is when we would expect that to happen. So there's usually some kind of asynchronous activity associated with setting that provider in a sense, but they all return immediately in the current implementations. So we were kind of looking at how this is a suspend function in Kotlin. And suspend functions, I'm not a Kotlin expert, but my understanding is really they can be kind of treated as blocking or not. It really depends on how they're called. But that's my only real concern is if once events are implemented, it means that we would then have a bit of a discomfort or a lack of ergonomics on the API because of that. I don't really feel too strongly about the solution that's chosen as long as it's kind of consistent with the other SDKs in a sense, and it feels comfortable to Kotlin users, and it's not going to break as soon as we implement a new feature or be unreasonable as soon as we implement a new feature. So that's kind of my entire take on the issue right now. But I'm not a Kotlin expert, so it makes it really hard for me to evaluate even potential solutions. So in a sense, I'm going to defer to other people, even the Spotify folks, on what makes the most sense. And I put a comment in the issue saying as much. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but that's kind of my last concern, I guess, with the SDK as it stands right now. The rest, I think we can implement as we go, just fine.
Yeah, I can comment on that. Basically, we have already a proposal. So we looked into the events kind of like proposal by OpenFeature, and except the part that we were setting callbacks and handlers, that now we are handling it with Kotlin concurrency framework, which is coroutines. So I think we have a proposal to go forward with that, like basically make the set provider not suspending and running it asynchronously, like the network request, and listening for the provider ready. We also created some additional helpers and extensions to help customers. Like, for example, when anyone wants to like listen for this provider ready, so we can observe the event of the provider ready and like even make the flag evaluations like observable. So just like listen, and then you can also listen for other events. Like we added the events that was proposed by OpenFeature specification, like provider error, provider stale, and yeah, I think we have a solution for that. Like, but we can check it later or go through it. I'm
yeah, that sounds good to me. Sorry, go ahead.
This is a right place to go like a bit technical, because otherwise we can also like present like what we did, but that anytime works better. We can go through it.
Yeah, I would be glad to have a meeting, and maybe we could set something up dedicated, and then the people who are interested in that specific technical point could come. But everything you just said makes perfect sense to me. Like I don't necessarily see like event handlers per se as Lambda functions that are passed around as necessary, especially if there's kind of a more Kotlin-esque solution that kind of works the same way effectively in code. Like I don't really mind, but yeah, basically all the points you just made, they sound like a perfect solution. And if we get to that point, then I would feel pretty comfortable saying this could be like a stable sub 1.0 release if we wanted. It would still be great to have more Kotlin expertise from within the org. I think maybe Oleg, you said you might be able to take a look. And I'm kind of partway through a similar review of the Swift SDK. So I don't know how much of this would be applicable there, if any, but yeah, I'm kind of just started. I haven't finished, but I'm gonna commit to get that done by the end of the week.
Related to at least the Kotlin one, releasing the artifact, have we looked at that at all? Is that something we have not done in the org?
So I did a little bit of scoping out, and again, please, people who are more comfortable with Android development, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's quite possible and quite common to host Android artifacts on Maven Central, for which we already have credentials and we can publish to. So if that's satisfactory to everybody, once it's in the org, we could just use the existing credentials and accounts and namespaces we've already validated, and we could push up like a dev.Android SDK or something like that, whatever, dev.openfeature.android or whatever we want to call it, depending on what we think is the right name. But I don't see that as an issue as long as we're okay with Maven Central.
Or is something better? I guess that is the question then. Is something else preferred? Because we can start investigating that soon.
We added, I mean, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but we're using the Jetpack, like Jetpack IO for OpenFeature SDK. And we also like integrated in the CI, like creating a release. Like when you create a tag, there is a new release with release notes and AR file to be released in the repo. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't really mind where it's released. I think one thing that we'd have to do is we would want to adapt it to be consistent with the rest of OpenFeature's release processes, which include kind of a democratized release process via release please. So releases are opened as pull requests. At the end of the day, they're still tagged. So we might be able to adapt the CI that you have, but we have release processes open with, we have releases open with automation, and then like there's the opportunity for community buy-in or blocking or whatever. And then once that PR is approved, there's an actual publish that happens. But it sounds like we could adapt whatever you have for that. Am I correct though, that, are you saying you're already publishing this artifact publicly or no?
So with Jetpack, I think the good thing about Jetpack is like with any open source, like library on GitHub, you can just like get the version. So like there is no need to kind of like upload it in some package manager or something. It's just like work with Maven.
It's compiled from source. Is every time, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and then there's versioning and branches and commit hashes and stuff. And there is Oleg raising.
Jetpack is really nice for bootstrapping things and getting initial evaluation, but there are certain limitations when we talk about large-scale adoption. Firstly, Jetpack is prohibited at many companies because it's not a trusted source of Maven packages, and it's also not a default one. So for many users, having the packages deployed to Maven Central, despite all the madness of getting it deployed from automation infrastructure, is what you actually has to do. Well, I just have to.
We've already done that hard work anyway, so it's fine. We do the progression through the RHOSS repos and everything, or OSSRH repos and everything. So yeah, I mean, Yeah, if it's a better idea to actually package it, I think that's fine. I'm not too worried about the CI process personally, as long as everybody's okay with where the artifact ends up.
Yeah, so we can automate releases. Maven Central is quite good even for continuous delivery of artifacts if you decide to do so. Yeah, and regarding tooling, etc., actually for GitHub Actions, it's something that is possible at the organizational scale. Why I can say it, because I spent just last week figuring it out from YMOC, because we have exactly the same problem of publishing right now from GitHub Actions. So maybe if we have something as add-on to JReleaser, we could reuse it in OpenFeature too. But yeah, so it's something we can also discuss as a part of all this flow, but happy to help.
Yeah, I'm not also very opinionated about Maven Central Jetpack. It's just like the easiest option you could do.
Yeah, Jetpack is really cool. Yeah, it just doesn't really work well for enterprises. And yeah, if we talk about high-grade features like as bombs, etc., well, nothing is integrated in the Jetpack at the moment. And as we discovered today, some IDEs also fail to pull Javadoc from Jetpack. So we just had a conversation with a few Red Hat guys today, because we use Jetpack for new models that we create. And apparently in some IDEs, it doesn't work as you may have expected. So yeah, but for the initial adoption, I think Jetpack is perfect.
Just to add, we use Jetpack for our Kotlin, and well, it's interesting what you say, Ollie. We haven't had anyone like complain that they can't use it. Yeah, if getting stuff into Maven like Central is just very, very painful, but it's really
yeah, it is.
painful.
I mean, from a security perspective, if I'm putting on my security hat for a second, assigned binary is always going to be more always going to be more of an easy sell to security teams than compiling from source. That's at the end of the day mutable.
Well,
I mean,
in practice, you do not compile from source. So what happens? Jetpack is basically a proxy server. It emulates Maven, but when it gets a request, it basically builds the stuff for you, and then it provides artifact. It includes GPG. I believe it includes jar signer too. So from the standpoint of end user and security team, if they do not deep dive, it's okay. The problem is that yeah, there are companies that block Jetpack explicitly. I cannot name these companies due to some reasons, but they are these companies.
Okay.
Plus, yeah, also all the caching. So if you use JFrog as a proxy, I think it's also going to be a bit of a problem.
I think that's really, unless there's any questions or follow-ups, I think that's really all I wanted to say on that topic. Yeah, I'm going to be working on a Swift review, and I'll do the same thing. Kind of open up a big document. I'll drop both those documents in the Slack channel, and I'll put the Kotlin one in these notes. I guess one thing from my perspective that well, maybe we should take that offline. I'll connect with you, Fabrizio, later. I guess the only other thing that I want to mention was the static and dynamic context, aka the client spec PR is scheduled to be merged tomorrow. We have a ton of approvals now, and a diverse set of approvals. So I'm going to merge that. If you have any objections or you want to review it before tomorrow, please do, and then say something if you want to change. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's a pretty exciting one. That one's been a long time coming. So nicely done. And just to let everyone know, like we decided from like a technical standpoint, we would keep static and dynamic context as like our terminology in the spec. But in the glossary, we added a section for client side and server side that basically like roughly matches or maps to the more like technical definitions that we settled on. So we can refer to it as like client side and server side SDKs, and that's how we'll probably visualize it in some of the docs and some of the filtering and things like that. But from like a technical perspective, we wanted to have the more like technically correct terminology. So, which kind of segues into the topic that I have. And just as a reminder, I'll link again, but if you have any topics, please feel free to add. Excuse me. But I just kind of wanted to quickly cover kind of the impact of this client side spec change and just all of the different like considerations that we'll have to make across the org. Most of them are quite minor, but things that I try to identify a list, and if anyone has any feedback or gaps, certainly let me know. But basically, we're going to have to very clearly denote on each SDK, like, is this intended for server side or client side? And I think coming up with just a simple little badge is probably the most straightforward option there. And then we'll update the template that we're using for basically all SDKs. And then just obviously go through and then add that to all existing SDKs. The Java contribs right now, since that one, I think that's the only one that this will affect immediately, but anything that we have like a contribs repo that could theoretically span both client and server, we'll also have to make sure that we clearly label like a provider or a hook or whatever to kind of highlight the intent. And as part of that, we have like a monorepo like generator for like creating providers and stuff. So we'll need to update that to basically support either side or both. Some like hooks, for example, could run potentially on either client or server. Then the documentation, so that's kind of a big one. The first one would be like that ecosystem page, expanding it so we actually have that terminology on there, and then we have like facet filters so you could see providers for the client, things like that. And then we'll have to expand like the doc section, so we'll have to make sure that we include more information on client side and basically what that what the impact is. And then existing SDK overview pages will have to have that little badge basically to specify if it's intended for client or server side. The playground has more or less been updated, but once it's like officially released, we'll have to make sure that we bump that latest web SDK version and then include that in the playground. And then I just wanted to quickly identify like a couple areas that I think we can go to next. And it's basically like once we have a solid like vanilla, client side SDK, having more proper support for things like React and possibly Angular, depending on kind of user demand. React is probably the most obvious one at the moment, but then expanding it to other popular frameworks. And that's basically it for the impact. I probably have missed a couple. I will continue to kind of like update this page, and I'll create some issues in the org to track this. And some of these are already underway, but I'm just trying to identify some basically touch points that will have to be considered as we merge in this spec change.
Mike, sorry, just out of interest, are there any client and server side single repository implementations out there?
So JavaScript will be affected by this primarily, because for our SDK, it is it's a monorepo, so we have like a bunch of shared pieces, but we also have a client side and a server side, so that will have to be there. And then the contribs, you could have a provider that's intended for Node basically, or one that's for the browser. And then same thing with hooks, and there's minor like differences between the hook behavior. So we'll have to just make sure that it's like clearly noted in the read
and runtime dependencies. Like you basically the modules have to have their surrounding runtime set up differently, because obviously the API is very different between Node and the browser. So it's configuration like that Mike's referencing, I think.
It doesn't sound like it's really possible to have like a universal one thing that like will work both client and server, or maybe it's not.
It could in some cases. Like the in-memory one could likely work essentially across boundaries, and things like really basic hooks could potentially do it. Like a logging hook or something theoretically could work across both. But
even then it would be essentially like the package would have to provide two kind of parallel implementations, I would assume, because the API is like slightly different.
I'd say it kind of depends. We're kind of probably getting slightly into the weeds. I can go into it, or I can show you the pull request or something when we finally get to it. But
Yeah.
for like a hook, both would have like an after hook, for example. So you could basically just have like a logging hook that would work in
Got it.
both places or something.
Got it.
So
Yeah. Whether it makes sense to have like a universal badge as well as like a client badge.
For sure, I think we should include that. But it's probably a bit rare, honestly, in most cases.
I mean, maybe that means it's not worth doing, and we just have like, you just get 2 badges if there's a universal.
That could be too. Yeah. So, which actually may be slightly preferred, because then it's like we've already vetted it for both client and server use cases or something.
It's probably really getting in the weeds, but it might not be a bad idea just from an ergonomics perspective to have those JavaScript SDKs like fail really hard if you try and use them in the wrong context. Like, because I think that might be something that people do when they first get started, is they accidentally download the Node SDK and try and use it.
Yeah, I could see that. And you could have some kind of devastating effects potentially.
Or even worse, like just subtly wrong, right? Like devastating is okay because you notice the devastation, but like if it's just like subtly wrong and you only find out 3 weeks later, then that's even worse.
Yeah, I guess that would be a lot worse. Yeah, you start it up and it looks all good until you actually roll it out to production.
The Java one's really good for that, because a lot of Java libraries work across Android and server side, and
right.
You can get into all manner of fun locking things, and yeah.
I think that's a good thing to consider then. Maybe it's like somehow in the SDK, we could say the intended use or something. And when you register a hook, we could see if it matches or something. So I think we could definitely look into it. That's a good point. Okay. Yeah. Anything else? I think we're basically through our list.
Thanks, Mike, for doing all of the tedious like project management stuff with the docs and updating things and badges and whatnot.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I guess that would be an interesting transition though, because like it would be helpful to start thinking about like developer docs. So like what it would take to create a provider, for example, and hooks. We have a little bit of that, but they're kind of nested in like blog posts and things. So I'd like to at least have an issue created where we could talk about like, kind of best practices and expectations for provider developers, essentially. And so if there's any interest in that, we could collaborate through the GitHub issue, but I think there would be a lot of value in kind of consolidating that knowledge in the doc somewhere.
I'll do one other Hail Mary request. Just if anybody has Kotlin knowledge or Swift knowledge and wants to kind of join in, especially if you're also familiar with the OpenFeature SDK, or you know anybody who is, and you want to help take a look at vetting some of the Spotify contributions. Yeah, I like I said, I'm getting to the point where I think it might be good to include them in the org, but I would love to have additional eyes, especially with more Kotlin and Swift experience on the SDKs to help.
Perfect. All right.
I
mean, sorry, go ahead, Pete.
Well, I was just thinking if Fahid had suggested, was asking whether this is an appropriate forum to kind of go into a more techie deep dive on some of the Kotlin stuff. And Todd, you were saying we could set up a meeting. You could also just use the half hour now if you've both.
That's what I was going to suggest. We could maybe wrap up here if there's no other topics, and we could basically let people drop if they're not interested in the technical nitty gritty, but otherwise it may be a good time to pivot.
Yeah, and I don't want to put any of the Spotify folks on the spot. Like if you guys don't want to share your screen, or you'd like to actually have more of like a scheduled meeting, that's totally understandable too. But if there's something you want to actually go over now or ask a question or or demonstrate something, explain something, the floor is yours if you want to.
So yeah, before we do that, I
uh,
guess, or I guess you can answer your question, but I guess before we actually dive into it, we can let people drop if they, yeah, unless they have anything else. Great, thanks, Bill. All right, thanks everyone.